This episode is brought to you by bewatersmart.info. Is your yard summer strong? A summer strong yard is tough enough to take the heat and still look its best. Here's 2 ways to help. First, replace your thirsty lawn with native and low water use plants and install drip irrigation and high efficiency rotor sprinklers. You'll use less water and have a healthier, happier yard. Second, here's how to help your trees grow strong enough to handle the summer heat. First, check the soil with a moisture meter or screwdriver to see if it's dry. If you need a water, set up a soaker hose or drip irrigation at the outer edges of the tree's branches. Water your trees at least once a month. Find more helpful tips and videos at bewatersmart.info.
Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I'm your host, Marlene, and tonight we're going to talk about a topic that if you are on Instagram or TikTok, or if you were alive last few years and are into plants, you may know that there was a houseplant craze, and that houseplant craze sort of fixated a little bit on aroids. So we're going to talk about aroids in general. We're not going to sort of hyper-focus on certain species or varieties because I'm with Bruce Ritter, and he grows aroids, and he takes care of the aroids at the conservatory for us. And we're sort of just a generalist with that. We're going to talk about basic care. So Bruce, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. How are you doing?
Good. So some people may remember that you were on because we were talking about how you live in Sac and that you grow a lot of tropical orchids and staghorn ferns outside, which
Right.
I'm still dumbfounded by the fact that you grow that outside. But we're not going to talk about that. But you may loop in the fact that you grow some of these aroids that are tropical outside, and we'll talk about some that can be grown outside. But a little bit of background, and I mentioned this in the last episode you were on, that you are the co-founder and the ex-president. We were both sort of, I'm not going to say kicked off the board, but reran our course.
We outlived, we reached our level of incompetence.
Exactly. We had to hand it over to people who could actually, okay, I'm just going to say you and the co-founder, Linda, did an amazing job. I try to quit at one point because I'm like, guys, I'm not contributing much. I'm a plant person. But now it's the big hitters are up there, the people who could get the land. And is that where we're at? I should say that you're co-founder and vice president or president of the Sacramento Botanic Garden. It's basically we're trying to get a world-class botanic garden in Sacramento. So just briefly, I know you can't talk about everything that's going on, but where does that stand?
Right. We are right now at the trying to get the land secured stage. We have a 60-acre area in South Sac that we're hoping we can get the use of. It's a little complicated, but let's leave it at. We always say we're 6 months away. I think we're always 6 months away.
There you go.
Securing the land.
That's fine. As long as it's within that year period, it feels like it's doable.
Right.
Yeah.
And our new board is an excellent board. We have our president is the former chairman of the board of SMUD Corporation, our utility provider, our electric provider, and we have former city council members. We have a former assistant city manager, which is a very high position in our city. So we've got some big hitters now, people who've been on the Crocker Art Museum board. So it's people who are influential and know the right people to talk to.
Yeah, because I think as plant people, we don't have that like desire for like power. We just want it done. We want to go and play with plants. Right. So we're like, whoever could get it done, here you go. So,
and I was more than happy to give up my position as president. It's much easier just being the guy who answers the emails.
Yeah, exactly. So then you're a retired optometrist.
I am.
And then you're like, wow, I have so much time on my hands. I'm going to go volunteer at the conservatory. And
there you go. And I do actually have a botany degree.
That is true. And so I love volunteers, and I love volunteers who I don't have to train much. And you were one of those. And you come in every Tuesday and you just take over. And I'm like, whatever you need, I say I'm going to go get the materials, but then every week I'm like, ooh, I didn't get around to that. Ooh, I didn't get around to that.
Yes, I am scrounging around for. What I am discovering seriously is that what you originally think is the mix you're going to use, it evolves with what's available. And as an orchid grower, the materials we were using 40 years ago, which worked great, are just not available today, or they're so prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that there are many ways to get the job done with mixes.
But for some reason, you did a little bit of ferns, but you sort of then went, hey, your aroid collection, which, we have a decent amount, it's which has always been ignored. And you said, hey, let me take over these aroids. And I said, oh my God, have at it. And because to me, aroids, they're beautiful. A lot of them are wonderful houseplants. They're difficult to display in a small area. And unfortunately, the conservatory is small because a lot of them are rambling. A lot of them are epiphytic, meaning they grow mainly in the canopies of trees up high. So I always feel bad for them. I'm just like, okay, can I do anything besides just cutting them back? Most of them grow okay in our conditions, so they don't need a lot of fuss. But of course, they were all, out of control. So you've taken over the aroids. So we're going to focus on that. And in the topic aroids, people grow houseplants or they've been around in this aroid craze. Certain things pop into their mind, but it's a really broad family. So it's the Araceae family. And what I know it as is the Amorphophallus titanum, the corpse plants in it, the calla lily, the common calla lily is in that family.
Right. And I did a little quick looking, as we call it, research. And what I discovered is it's actually one of the more primitive flowering plant families. And it is I wouldn't say it's on all continents, probably except Antarctica. Maybe I don't think it's in Australia, but it's a very old plant family and it is found around the world.
Yes.
From temperate to tropical.
Yeah, so that makes it, old basically if it's on all the continents, like the Euphorbiaceae family, because, all the continents. And then, that's the surprising thing. Most people think, oh, they're tropical, but there are some xeric species. And we'll talk about one that we have at the conservatory. So most of them are tropical growing. And I could see, they're an older family and they're not known. They're known more for their, I would say almost 98% known for their foliage, except for some of the, the titanariums are known for their inflorescence. But let's talk a little bit about their morphology, specifically their flowers. So if someone has a calla lily, those are pretty showy, but others you may, if you have a houseplant aroid, you may every once in a while see it bloom and be like, what is this? It's interesting, but it's not super showy.
And if you've seen the common, it's not so common, but the jack in the pulpit, which is a very common plant in the Northeast, you'll see that all aroids have what they call a spathe, which is a modified leaf, and a spadix, which is a little short flowering stem. And so it gives you your calla lily look, or your tip. You'll see now when you go to the supermarkets, you'll see your anthuriums with the red flowers and the little yellow spikes sticking out. It's not really a flower. Again, it's just a modified leaf and that little spike. And on that spike, you have lots and lots of very small flowers. And I think, Marlene, the order of the flowers are male or female, or just the male parts open first?
So from, always focusing on the Amorphophallus, but it does vary is, so you have, it's an inflorescence, which means it's a cluster of flowers on all of them.
Right.
And they can be monoecious, meaning you have male and female flowers on one, or you have perfect flowers on one plant. So I'm just going to talk about the Amorphophallus, for instance, because that one I'm really highly familiar with is on the spadix. You have at the bottom of it is a cluster of female flowers. So they're only female. And they're open and receptive to pollen first, coming in for the Amorphophallus. Anything that smells gross is pollinated by dung beetles, and flies. And so it's functional as a female first. And then for the Amorphophallus, like the titanum, it shuts down for like an hour. And then the male flowers, which are on rows on top, and you could have hundreds of them, hundreds of these
Right.
flowers on large inflorescence. And then it will shoot out its pollen in almost like these string-like appendages. And of course, the purpose of having your female flowers be active first is you want to shut the females down because you don't want them to expose to any pollen because
Right.
you're not self-pollinating. So almost always it's going to be the female active first, followed by the male. Usually that's across the board for most flowers when you have male and female even on the same flower. So that's like a monoecious, you have them on both. But I think there are some, and I don't know any off the top of my head, that are dioecious, meaning you have male flowers and female flowers only. I think most are going to be that male, female,
Yeah.
separate flowers on the same plant.
I couldn't say either if I know any that are on different plants. I will say that one of the biggest problems is you have this fantastic, beautiful Levanthurium in bloom in the greenhouse, and you only have one inflorescence. And of course, you want to self-pollinate it because it's a very rare species. And the female flowers come first, or the female portion of the inflorescence comes first, and the males come later. So the problem is you can't even save the pollen for that particular flowering spike. You have to hold the pollen and wait till the next flower rises because the female parts are active first.
Yeah,
receptive.
we have visitors that come in and say, hey, you have, this plant is active right now and I have some male pollen. Do you want me to come in? And usually I'm like, well, we don't need any more of that plant, but go for it. If you want to produce seed, that's fine. Yeah, but so, thinking about pollination is the first thing, one of them that comes to mind, that's also an edible fruit that is probably one of the most common houseplants is the Monstera deliciosa.
Right.
So that is
interesting. Named deliciosa for a reason, right?
It is, and I could attest to that it is very good, but there is a big asterisk next to that. So Monstera deliciosa is I guess they call it Swiss cheese plant.
Right, that's one of the common names. It used to be called a philodendron, and now it's a monstera.
That's right, yeah, and sometimes people still use them interchangeably, and the reason being is, so it's an epiphytic plant, meaning it grows in the soil, but it wants to crawl up the trees. So a lot of times people have problems in their houses because it wants to take over, and people want these nice, tidy plants. And we'll talk about that in a second. I'll let you handle the pruning of them.
Sure.
So we have an old one at the conservatory, and it will flower. And then it will fruit. And we've harvested the fruit before, and it is a known fruit that is grown in, Central America, and it's really good. And so it is pollinated, and it's edible, but all aroids, one of the characteristics of an aroid is they have calcium oxalates in their foliage and in their fruit. And then I guess in the fruit, it's termed raphids. And it is like eating glass shards.
So I was going to ask you, you can't eat it off the tree. You have to cook it first, right?
I don't think so. I don't think you need to cook it because I think
off the tree.
Yeah. So
Wow.
we've picked them at the conservatory, and other people have eaten them and they're fine. And I've eaten them and I'm like, oh my God, every third movement of the tongue, it feels like there's glass. And either I'm more sensitive to it, or I think I also have a feeling that maybe it's broken down with ripeness and the sun, and I was eating it. I mean, it seemed like it was the last round seemed like it was pretty ripe. It was falling apart. But that is a characteristic, is those calcium oxalates. So when people are growing houseplants, and a lot of houseplants are aroids, and they have pets or kids, the Dieffenbachia is an aroid, and that's a very easy plant to grow. And that was one of the first houseplants I ever grew. And my cat would chew on it and throw up. And, but cats eat anything green and throw up. And this was before Google, so it wasn't like I could just Google. And I'm like, okay, he's eating something green and throwing up. And then years later, I realized, oh, I'm poisoning my cat.
And, it's a politically incorrect common name, but one of the common names of Dieffenbachia is dumb cane, D-U-M-B. And I think the reason is because if you eat it, it swells up your tongue and it renders you speechless.
Yes, and I have two stories for that. One of them was through so this was I heard it from someone who heard it from someone that students needed to do an oral exam and they chewed on some leaves of the Dieffenbachia to lose their voice. So they had more time. But I don't know if that's true or not. But
Well,
another story I heard is that slave owners would force feed it to slaves or give it to slaves because the one thing slaves could do during work time was sing. And this actually numbed their vocal cords. So
it's a wonderful world.
Yes, isn't it though? Yeah, I know. It's like, so I'm like, oh, great. So that's one of the inflorescence of having that spadix and spathe, and the flowers, and then the calcium oxalates. Those are key characteristics of the Aroid family. So you grow some outside.
Yes. What I have discovered, well, first of all, in our Sacramento area, people grow, I don't know the new name, it used to be called philodendron bipinnatifolia or something like that, but it's now a thamatophyllum something. But it's the big giant leaved philodendron. They leave it at that.
Yes. It's the split leaf philodendron.
Split leaf philodendron, thank you. And yes, I'm really good with scientific names, but they change so much.
They change a lot, yeah.
And it's a wonderful outdoor plant. It probably needs some protection, I think, in a colder winter when we get here. I don't think it'd be happy under 25 degrees, but I've seen plants that were, 10 by 20 feet wide in people's gardens under a protective tree.
Yeah, similar to that. So that is one that can grow outside. Similar to that is once again, the Monstera deliciosa is very similar to that. And we had one grown outside of the conservatory up against a south wall, protected. So if they're protected, certain species or genus, those two could grow outside. But yeah, if you get a really cold freeze, then
you have to protect it.
Yeah, you have to protect it.
And there's a new one that I discovered. I think, let's just say it's a philodendron Evansii, Evansii. It's very hard to get. I have two of them. It's similar to the split leaf philodendron, except that the leaves are not split, they're more entire. And I've had that outside in pots right now in an area where my begonia leaves froze and my impatiens froze. So I know that it's at least a little bit harder than there, and there's been no damage at all on the leaves. So that's a newer variety that's hard to get. I searched for quite a few years, and once I can propagate it, we'll start spreading it around.
Wow. Okay, so that's pretty cold tolerant if it's by your impatiens. And
right, and
yeah,
and I've seen full large plants about 5 by 6 feet of that in the Southland Park area of Sacramento. So it does tolerate reasonably cool and occasional frosts.
Wow. Did you say you have some alocasias outside?
Well, a lot of people in the Northeast are growing colocasias outside.
Yes, okay.
Which is taro. The alocasias I do not have outside, although I do read here and there that they're zone 9B plants. I'm not so sure I believe that, but I've read that.
Yeah, so the taro is relatively easy to grow. We have one called Black Magic, and this is taro that is edible, the rhizome. So a lot of these plants are tuberous or rhizomatous, and the Black Magic taro grows in our pond, and I just had a student rip huge amounts out because it grows overnight, like it could double in size. And so that one,
and
yes.
I think
Go ahead.
I just want to add that when we say that taro is edible, that is one that must be cooked or it will be a misery to eat because of those oxaloacidic crystals.
Yeah, and I think that goes for everyone because going back to the Amorphophallus, there is a species, Amorphophallus konjac, that is, I know it's was used as a diet substitute, And then it's also a food crop along with Amorphophallus peonifolius, which is called, I think, the elephant foot's yam. And those are corms, giant corms. And because of the calcium oxalates, they need to be cooked. Yes.
Right.
That could be bad.
But, so just a little, just so someone doesn't call it and say, I ate it and not in the hospital. Well, we warned you.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of that, I have a story. So I was watching, this was years ago, and I was watching TV, and there was this diet drug that came on. And of course, I ignore most diet drugs, but they showed a picture of the package, and what flashed across was ingredients, Amorphophallus konjac. And I'm like, what? That's what they're touting as the diet food. So I had to go get it to see. And speaking of emergency room, I literally almost went to the emergency room after taking a dose because it's all fiber. And all it did was just bloat me to the pain of excruciating pain. And I haven't seen it on the market since, but I'm like, this is awful. I mean, not only do I not want to eat, I want to die.
And apparently there's a noodle made from Amorphophallus
konjac
corms.
Yes, same thing. It has, I don't know how it could have it's supposed to be low carbs. I don't know how it could have no carbs when it's actually from the corm, which is all starch. Go figure.
Yes, well, maybe because it goes through you so quickly that it never gets a chance to be absorbed.
You know what? That's probably it. Yeah, I saw that and I'm like, there's no way in hell I am trying that, because that was excruciating pain. But people do eat the Amorphophallus konjac, the Amorphophallus peonifolius, but I'm sure they cook it and prepare it in a different way than some of these drugs are being made. Yeah. So the taro can grow outside. A lot of people grow the colocasia. I could never pronounce it. Alocasia, colocasia. I have to say both. As houseplants. And I get so many pictures where it's like, I have one leaf that comes up and then it dies. Another leaf comes up and it dies.
Yeah, I've been actually very unsuccessful growing colocasias outdoors here.
Okay.
I don't think they like our dryness. I know in the Northeast people grow them. I mean, I have a friend who's growing beautiful ones in New York City in his little courtyard. And they are beautiful because they love the humidity, I think. They love the warmth, and as long as the roots don't freeze solid, I think that they do well. So mulching in a cold climate, but I've found that here, they just never, for me anyway, they never seem to get big enough that I'm like, wow, look at that. Because they're supposed to have leaves. Some of them, those colocasias, have leaves that are 3 by 5 feet wide. I never have reached that proportion in mine.
No,
so it might be the dryness.
No, I think you're correct with a lot of problems people have with certain aroids inside. Is these plants, for the majority of them, are from tropical regions, and the the more humid environment they're from, you're bringing it into your house where the ambient humidity could be 20%. Right. And they're just not happy, so they show up, brown edges, crinkling leaves, just not growing. So not all aroids are going to be the same. And if we talk about, you mentioned the anthurium that most people are familiar with the colorful spathe, is the anthurium you see around the holidays with the red one, is, a lot of people struggle with that one, but it's also the soil. So let's talk a little bit about the mixes that you use at home, the mixes people could use, and what you're using at the conservatory for planting and for growing up on a pole, because a lot of these are trailers and climbers.
Right. I think I'll talk about the medium, then I think they're really good to talk about how we do it on the poles and why that really is, if you can, the best way to grow them. In my humble yet belligerent opinion, what we use at the conservatory, I sort of played with the mix until I found something that just felt right. Ultimately, things that are epiphytic, they generally are going to be periodically dry, in the sense that they get watered, let's say, with a downfall, and then they might dry out towards the end of the day. But of course, in a tropical rainforest environment, they'll get watered again. So they really never quite dry out, like a cactus dries out. But in any case, you want the typically confusing term moisture retentive yet well draining. And that is actually something we hear all the time, and it almost sounds like an oxymoron. Like, how could it be moisture retentive and well draining? So what I use in the mix there is we use a base of cedar mulch, which is sort of shredded cedar bark, I guess.
Yeah.
And then to that, I will add equal amounts of moderate sized orchid bark, which there are so many different types out there. We use Orchiata, I believe, at the conservatory, which is hard to get, but it's a nice, long-lasting bark. It doesn't break down very quickly. I'll add large perlite to that, and again, probably 1/3. We can post the recipe online, I guess, at some point.
Yeah, sure.
So I'll use some large perlite. I will add that expanded shale, which is those little rock balls you see around. People grow hydroponically in them. I will add some tree fern fiber, which is the shredded stem of a tree fern, believe it or not. And then I think that's probably what I'm using right now. Recently at the conservatory, we ran out of the expanded shale and we ran out of a large perlite.
Sorry, I need to go shopping.
That's okay. But what I did instead is I added I added largest bark that we have, and I added a little bit more of that. Plus I added, instead of perlite, I used large pumps.
Wait, but this is for this is for the poles.
This is for the poles, but I'm also using that for the base too.
Oh, okay. So you're planting in it, and which makes sense, because if they're epiphytic, there's at a certain point they could start in the soil in the ground, or a piece could just fall off and start rooting in a tree. Right. And this is the mix. So if you picture like a canopy of a tree in the tropics with so much debris, that's what you're going to get. So you're talking about how it's sort of an oxymoron, saying it's like water retention, but let it dry out. I always like to think of it as lots of air pockets, but everything around it is sort of like there's material in there that is holding moisture, but then there's a lot of air pockets as well. So you're just, go ahead.
I was just going to say that when you think about it, the cedar mulch, that's very moisture retentive, but the bark, the perlite, or the expanded shell, all of these, expanded shell especially, which is inorganic, that's not going to decompose, nor is the perlite or the pumice. So those are essentially the air spaces between the more moist cedar mulch, which holds a heck of a lot of water, actually.
Yeah. So if you have something that's going to break down and you have this moss pole and plants growing on it it's sort of like when I tell people, like, you add compost to raise your soil beds. Over time, it's going to decrease, and then you have less airspace. So you have these plants that get less happy because they don't have air. Is so incredibly important for plants to grow. And the funny thing is, we used the cedar mulch because we were going to use sphagnum moss. And one, it's very expensive. And I got, the carnivorous plant grower, Sean, he was like, what? He can't use that for aroids. That's for my carnivorous plants. How dare you use it? The aroids don't need that. And sure enough, I guess they didn't. The cedar mulch that we went to Ace to buy, it's probably the cheapest planting media we've bought ever at the conservatory. So all this,
working.
Yeah, all this stuff people could buy. The poles that we're using, so I know some people make their own. Go into like sort of the pole structure.
Sure.
And how you.
I just want to say one thing about the pots themselves with the base mixture. A lot of the plants at the conservatory were in a previous mix. I don't know exactly what that mix was. You can maybe go over that if you want, but. I didn't repot those plants. I just added the moss poles to them because they were growing, they were rooting, and I didn't really want to disturb the roots since my goal was to get them to grow up the poles. But back to the poles. So what we do is there is a new product out there. You can actually get these in black plastic or clear plastic. The advantage of the black plastic is that light doesn't pass through it, so you don't get algae growth inside the moss pole. But it's basically a tube, which has little flaps. You can connect it from a piece of flat plastic into a tube. And the center of the tube, or the front of the tube, is a little hexagonal netting, or with almost like chicken wire with little holes in it so that the roots can grow in through there. So what we do is we take those plates of plastic. We roll them into tubes and we fill them with the mix. What I learned just recently is it's a lot easier to fill them before you close them than after you close them, which is saves me tons of time. But what I do, a lot of people used to fill them with moss, just pure sphagnum moss. A, it's expensive. B, sphagnum moss, I believe personally, as pure medium, it's okay. But when you have big, thick tubes of sphagnum moss, it can get really wet inside and then start to become anoxic. Or if you miss watering, it gets super dry and it's very difficult to get sphagnum to re-wet once it's really dry. So what I do is I now take some sphagnum moss, I put it on the hexagonal portion of the tube with holes in it. Then I add the mix on top of that, and then I close it up. And so that way it's a lot easier to get the mix in there. It also looks a lot nicer. So then what we do with that is we'll mount that, we'll take that and place it vertically standing onto the top of the pot. These moss pole holders, containers have little flaps that theoretically go into the soil, but they never really go in. They just sort of bend.
Yeah.
Once you get them in, we then take some stakes, and I like cedar stakes because they last long. Bamboo is fine too. And through the pole itself, I'll put the stakes in and push them down to the bottom of the pot. So you have to make sure your stake is long enough. And that keeps the moss pole vertical because obviously it's just sitting on top of the pot. It needs to be staked somehow so it doesn't fall off the pot. At that point, theoretically, we have a plant now that's starting to grow and vining all over the place. So what I will do is I will take the vine and I will attach it to the moss pole using twist ties or zip ties, or if we have nothing else, we can just use that green strippy plastic that you can tie stems. If you want to stake something take a stem to the stakes. It's that stretchy stuff. So it's really not great because it does stretch, which means over time it'll be too loose. But if that's all you have, it works.
Yeah, and ideally the roots will be growing inside the moss, into the moss pole, in theory.
And what's great is then what I do is I will line the stem of the plant up so that some of the roots are right at the sphagnum moss on the exterior portion of the pole. And I like to take those areas and just make them a little more tightly bound to the pole so that when the roots grow, they'll grow right into the pole. And it works.
Yeah.
And just, yes.
Well, I was saying, and you're doing that. So you haven't transplanted a lot of ours, but what you're trying to do is get a good healthy piece growing attached to a pole. And then you're almost making a new plant out of it by making a cutting.
Right. One of the big problems that we've had there is that the plants grow so well, but they're not supported. And so they start to grow all over the benches. Number one, it takes up a lot of space. Number two, you end up with a pot, then 3 feet of stem, and then a plant growing somewhere else and starting to bend and not really looking very attractive. So what I've been doing is I've been taking the peripheral part of the plant, mounting those to moss poles, and not necessarily having a pot underneath, but just something to get the roots to start to grow in. And then as they grow, I cut once I know there's good root system in the moss pole, I'll cut the stem at the bottom, and then I'll essentially just place that on a pot. And that's where I won't be too attentive to the mix. I might use just more of a rocky mix because I need weight to hold the pot down.
And this is important because if someone has a giant Monstera, a giant philodendron at home, one of the big problems is how do I prune this, or how do I regain control of this? And you could either prune it back because they're perfectly fine with being butchered and cut back. They don't care. Or like you're doing, you're starting a new plant by controlling a growth of, say, a branch, and then you're cutting the base and you're rerooting it like a cutting, but you have already the piece growing up. So people could do this at home. If you have a Monstera philodendron out of control, you could use multiple moss poles in different pots. It doesn't even have to be the one that the roots are growing in. You could just put pots with something, or you could just start one of these and it's like a cutting that you're already rooting into the moss pole, or cut the whole entire plant back. It's up to you.
And it's very similar. As just talking about that, I'm realizing it's very similar, or maybe it really is, what we call air layering, which is where you take a plant that doesn't root well, like a rhododendron. I think they do this too. You make a little cut in the stem, you pack it with sphagnum moss, and I guess they use rooting hormone, and the plant grows in that little pocket of sphagnum moss. It roots. It's the same thing, really, when you think about it.
I think it's more trench layering, Bruce. I'm just going to throw that in there. Trench layering is when you get a pot and you take a portion of a branch and you root it, put it in a planting media, and it roots. But because a lot of these plants already have aerial roots, who's to say who's right?
Well, I'll go with whatever you say, because you have the degree. I'm just some guy.
Yeah, hey, didn't you just say you had a degree in botany? So there you go. But yeah,
there you go. And one of the nice little extras is when you do this, a lot of times you'll have the pot. There'll be a little stem growing from a little offset growing from the main stem, 4 feet of bare stem, and then the plant. So what you do is, once you get your big portion of the plant onto your moss pole, you separate, you pot it up, then you cut the rest of the stem off, and you have a nice plant at the base. We've done quite a few of those that way, and they're starting to. I've separated my first one, actually, first 2 of them the other day. Now, I started these 6 months ago, so it's took a while.
Yeah.
But now we have all the space in between is now taken away, and we have bench space now, which we didn't have before.
Yes. I love bench space. Means more space for more plants.
Right. Or one could say more space between the plants.
Yeah, no,
that makes for a healthier plant.
I actually prefer that. Trust me, I prefer that. I like to see the individual. I wish some of these we could see individually even more, because they are beautiful structures, and sometimes they just get overcrowded and you don't really see the individual plant. Right. So we're talking about certain things that are vining and you could prune pretty much anywhere. But then on the opposite side, you have certain things like the anthuriums that have one major growth point. And going back to the red spathe, the anthurium most people know about, is that will get longer and longer. First of all, people don't like it because I think they plant it in standard soil mix. It shows up at the nursery in like a peat moss.
Right.
So they need to create more aeration. But what is there to do with anthuriums once they start getting bigger and bigger, and then they start having some aerial roots showing?
Well, here's an interesting thing. What I've been doing with my anthuriums is I've actually been taking the moss poles, cutting them in half, because I don't need a 2-foot moss pole for a plant that doesn't grow quickly, doesn't grow vertically that quickly. But I have been mounting them to it. The roots grow up and down the moss pole, and the anthuriums is a slow grower, but it does actually prefer that. So they still like the climbing aspect, but a lot of anthuriums you can just grow in that standard, what I call the standard aroid mix. But the point being that they do have the thick roots. They like a well draining, moist mixture, and they'll do fine on that. For the anthuriums with red flowers, we at Anthurium andrianum, years ago, and I mean 40 years ago, I used to work at Planting Fields Arboretum on the East Coast, and they had an anthurium collection. By the way, that collection is still there. I think they're the same plants.
Oh my God!
And what we used to do is we would just, as they grew, we pack what was it called, osmunda fiber, which is the root of the osmunda fern. That was a common growing medium then. We pack it around the stems. The roots would grow into the osmunda fiber, and then when they got big, we just cut them off and start new ones, and just replant them. So anthuriums really you're treating the same way as your climbing aroids. Just think of them as a plant that climbs much more slowly.
Yeah.
But the concept's the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So they have sort of that one focal growth point, but if they're happy, you'll see the aerial roots coming off of them, and you're just attaching that, and it's climbing. Just picture that moss pole as a tree trunk, and it's sort of attaching as it grows up, and then the lower portions start just dying off as it's sort of growing up. But all the ones we're talking about really need that same amount of soil, or type of soil, basically, to mimic the side of a tree trunk. So I like that. I mean, that helps a lot.
And
Oh.
here's a little plus. Now, some people might not like this plus, but what happens is when the plants are climbing, their leaves will be bigger. We've had some plants. I think this one I just did maybe within the last 3 months. It's a philodendron, and it's a more obscure species. But the leaves in the last 3 months have doubled in size from when I put them on the moss pole. So if you like the big giant leaf and you put it on a moss pole, you will get those. Be much more likely to get the big giant leaves. And it works with the anthuriums too, even that don't climb. Some of these anthuriums that we grow with the beautifully veined leaves, some of those leaves can be 3-4 feet wide, depending on the species. And I've been in Hawaii, and I almost bought a house because it had an anthurium with a leaf 1 foot by 6 feet or so growing in its front yard. Now the plant is growing in lava, but actually it's not growing, it's dead because it's buried under 30 feet of lava.
Oh, good thing you didn't buy the
Correction.
house. Oh my God. It got hit by the lava flow recently?
It got hit by the lava flow. That's a beautiful part of Hawaii.
Oh no.
But
Oh.
when they have the ability to have their roots climb up and down through essentially up the tree, as far as the plant's concerned, the leaves are much bigger. And if you don't have room, maybe you don't want to do that. But if you love the big leaf forms, then you really want to get them climbing on those poles, even if the pole is 1 foot tall and that's all the plant's going to grow in 3 years. You get the effect of growing it on a tree branch, and the leaves will be bigger and healthier.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, the takeaway is almost all these, not all, are epiphytic, and they want to climb no matter the structure, and they
Right.
want that loose soil. So it's always, I tell people what we do is when we get a plant in is figure out where it's native to, figure out how its growing habitat, and then try to mimic it that as best as possible. And some of these
Right.
are going to be, a losing battle because some are in areas that you just can't mimic inside. You can't mimic, we try with a greenhouse, of course, and it's easier than if you're trying to mimic the house, but there's different, easy versus difficult. But yeah, I mean, I just want to mention that not all of them are tropical. We just recently got one that's a xeric aroid, meaning it is in a really dry area. And to be honest, I had to look up the name today to figure out, because I'm like, it's lost all of its foliage. I either killed it by overwatering or underwater, because I tend to it's grown in our desert room, and I tend to underwater our succulents. Right. But no, it'll go dormant. So they like you said, they're in pretty much all the continents except for Antarctica, so they're going to be in various different growing conditions. But there are xeric aroids. Go figure. Yeah.
And I did want to mention the alocasias versus the colocasias.
Yeah.
The colocasias are garden plants. The alocasias, they are not. We have some that get pretty tall with age, but they're generally not climbers.
Yes.
And those seem to take. I haven't tried them in that more porous soil, but I tend to grow them in a little denser mix, and they do fine. And of course, in the garden, when you're growing the colocasias, even though they don't go great in our climate, they're basically in regular garden soil. So they don't. The ones that are not going to climb, you want to be careful because not everyone. Plants don't read the books, so they don't necessarily follow the general rules. But they seem to take a closer to like what I use for my begonias, more of a typical, a quote unquote house planty soil.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, there are so many varieties that are just garden plants, as you mentioned, calla lilies, jack in the pulpits. There are some that you grow in your pond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They not,
Yeah, and our alocasias at the conservatory, they are growing in our standard soil, but our standard soil is almost the equivalent of most people's succulent mix. So it has really low, and it has really low inorganics. It's it's pumice, it's coconut coir, a little bit of coconut coir, it's decomposed granite, but it is way heavier and water retaining than the mixture that you're growing the epiphytic ones in. But they're okay because they're not climbers. They're not growing in the canopies of the tree. They're growing in the soil, but you still don't want them in solid peat. And a lot of plants, and you've heard me say this before, plants from nurseries, when you get a plant, especially like a gift plant or something, it's in straight peat moss, and it's super wet. So we grow them in our standard mix, which is still very light and airy, because we err on the side of caution of overwatering. It just happens that they handle more water. And like I mentioned, our taro is growing in our pond, and it's just growing like crazy.
And it could be just growing with in the water with maybe some muck at the bottom of the pond holding it down.
Yeah.
Not necessarily even in a pot.
Yeah.
About those peat moss, peat mixes that are just pure peat that you get a lot of these plants in. We have a friend, and he has a business called Floriculture, and he gets these plants, sometimes comes in, and the way he puts it to me is, if you don't get them out of the peat pots, the peat mixture that they come in, you might as well send them directly into your garbage, because they're not going to survive. That a lot of the times we get these plants, and I'll go to just the regular nursery, and they have very nice looking plants, but they've been grown under greenhouse conditions. They've been mass produced. They don't have the ability to sit there and take care of each one individually like we do. So for whatever reason, you get these plants and they look nice, but their roots are not happy. And you really want to get them out of that mix as soon as possible.
It's sort of like the poinsettia trade is, they get a pot and they stick a poinsettia cutting. And so peat moss is a great rooting soil for most things. And so they don't need to transplant it out, and it holds moisture, and it's, they transport it, holds the moisture, but by the time the plant is sort of aging, it's too much. So it's a very short-term thing. And for us, any plant that we get in, we try to quickly get it out of any soil, even if it's not peat, when we get it into a soil that works for us. And what I mean by that is our watering requirements. So if you tend to not water a lot at all, peat it's sort of like the orchid mix. When you get like a gift orchid, they're in sphagnum. That may work for people who don't water a lot versus orchid bark, but most people overwater their plants versus underwater. So it's really what works for you, but also the number one thing back again is look to see where and how this plant grows and try to mimic that as much as possible.
And when you're buying a plant, you're going to buy this plant, you're going to pay for it, and if it's healthy, you're going to take it home with you. So within reason, there's nothing wrong if you go to a place and you see a plant and it looks good and you say, I'm going to take this home with me. It's in a 4-inch pot. It's okay to take the plant out of the pot that you're going to buy and see if it actually has nice, healthy roots. And if the roots are basically just muck, well, don't feel guilty for putting it back and not taking it, because they were selling you a plant that was going to die anyway.
There you go.
Within reason, we don't want you unpotting every plant and then telling them, well, they said it on the podcast. But the point is that if you're buying a plant and the roots are terrible, the plant's probably just not going to make the change to your conditions.
Yeah. And I was going to say that goes back to some of these plants, though. If you think like pothos, okay, so the most common aroid probably is pothos epiprenum. I can never pronounce that. People know it as pothos. I get pictures all the time, and people are rotting out the roots on that. But there might be 2 feet of viable plant growth. So that's one where if you have a plant and you think you've rotted it out and there's cutting material, go for it and cut it and root it in water. It'll take.
Oh, yeah. Pothos, pothos used to be $5 plants until they became epiprenium. Now they're $50 plants.
That much?
If you've been in,
I hope not.
It's what's the difference between a vase and a vase? A vase costs 10 times more than a vase. If you go into Hawaii, you see pothos that have escaped. And what you see is, and I know that it depends on the species, but what you see is pothos growing up trees with leaves that are like 2 feet wide.
Yes.
They want to grow. So pothos is like, if you can kill a pothos, then maybe you need to go over to plastic plants.
Oh, come on. You just got to try again. Change the soil. But, okay, going back to the pothos as well, because I'll get questions where people are like, oh, my mom had this plant for 20 years, or I've grown this. Why is the center completely empty? And then they'll have, all the growth. going back is this plant's a climber. It's trying to get to the sunlight. It doesn't need those lower leaves. It's lost those lower leaves. So you're going to have these long stems without anything, because in the wild, that's how it grows. It doesn't look great for a houseplant because you want bushy, you want more leaves. So what can people do for that, Bruce?
Well, there's several things you can do. The first one, of course, is planning ahead, which is when you get the plant and you see it starting to get a little straggly, to prune it back, basically with a pothos, with another aroid called the syngonium.
Yes.
It really helps when they start to vine to cut them. You can take those pieces and root them. You can give them to friends, or you can toss them. It's okay. And that way, the plant will branch and will give you a little bushier growth. Of course, remember, it is a vine. It's still going to want to vine again.
Yes, yeah.
So I have syngoniums. When the plant starts to vine, those nice heart-shaped leaves generally become more like foot-shaped with multiple leaflets. Some people like that. Some people don't. But I do cut them back, and then I'll just be cutting them back probably every 6 to 8 weeks, because in the warm weather they grow. So you can prune them. That's number one, in advance before they get too big.
Something else you could do too is you could do like people who have don't have a lot of hair and they do the sort of the brush over, the comb over. I always say you could take one of the branches because they root so easy from the nodes, and they might already have some aerial roots coming out of the nodes. You could just circle it back around into the plant and make a cutting basically with it still attached and have it root into the soil.
Absolutely. And I do that too. And so that way, if you didn't pinch back in advance, then you have these moderately long stems. You just stick them back on the top of the pot. You can clip them down with a little opened paper clip just to make it hold there a little better.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
And that works. And it makes a nice bushy plant.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about water, types of water, fertilizing, and pests.
Sure. I want to talk about pests first, because there's an interesting little anecdote that happened at the conservatory. We had a pot, and in this pot was an orchid. And in this pot of an orchid was also an anthurium that just happened to make a seed and sprout in the plant. Well, this orchid was I think it was an orchid, but it was so full of scale that it was like, do we even have the ability to save this plant? I think we might have saved it. I haven't seen it around recently, but I know my pieces of it did not make it. But there was an anthurium in the same pot which had nothing on it. I mean, the orchid was infested. The anthurium had not a bug on it, and we took those out, potted them up, and they're growing beautifully and have not needed any supplementary insecticide. So I think number one, as far as pests go, is they seem to be really resistant to pests. When plants next to it are infested, they seem pretty clean.
Yeah, every once in a while there'll be a 2-spot spider mite, but not on the trailing ones, on just certain aroids. And every once in a while some mealybugs, but for the most part, you're correct. They do not. And that scale that was on the stupid I shouldn't say stupid orchids. The stupid scale that was on the orchids is that armored scale, and it's really loves orchids. And of course, it was moving on a little bit to our prayer plants, but yeah, for the most part, they're not super problematic as pests go. Mealybugs, possibly 2-spot mite. So it's just basically be monitoring it and keep some, rubbing alcohol handy.
Yeah. I think the Araceae tend to be more prone to spider mites than the others.
I agree.
And that's,
yeah.
They don't like it dry. And if we grow them outdoors here, they're dry.
I know.
But yeah.
I know Dieffenbachia could get the a certain scale, like the the scale that's not armored scale, but sort of the hard shell scale. I remember that because just take a wet paper towel and wipe it all off, and then do like a rubbing alcohol spray. Yeah, so it's just getting rid of it, and then once you realize it, being vigilant about spraying something on it.
Right. Yeah. And then water quality and feeding, of course, those go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Over at the conservatory, I believe you water with deionized water.
Well, we run FERT through it every single time. So it's
Right. So
not straight
exactly.
DI. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, out where I live in Carmichael now, and our water in the summer, apparently it's river water, and in the winter it's artesian well water. So it gets more calcium in it in the winter.
It's still
Um,
beautiful
I,
water.
it's very good water though, and
Mm-hmm.
I do have some spots in my plants which I did not have when I lived in Land Park.
Okay.
But I will say that if I have an RO system for my fish tank, so I can just mix it in. So the main thing is you don't want your dissolved salts to be too high, but realistically, they'll do well on almost any water as long as it's not super super hard water.
Yeah.
Um,
And the same
and
thing goes. It seems to be the smaller the leaf, the less noticeable it is. If you have some of these um, anthuriums or alocasias, calocasias that have like maybe 4 leaves on them and they're huge and they don't cycle through, if you have hard water or you over fertilize or you have salts, you're going to see those brown edges more so.
right. And then with fertilizer, of course, if you use your fertilizer too high strength and you have a lot of dissolved salts in your water, you will run into a problem. What I do, if you're going to use deionized reverse osmosis water, I made the mistake of watering that on my plants and not feeding for a while. And of course, the plants went downhill because there was nothing in the water. It was pure
Yes.
H2O.
Yeah.
And the plants were getting no nutrients.
Yeah.
But there are fertilizers formulated specifically for distilled water. The Michigan fertilizer is Michigan State University fertilizer is one.
Okay. Wow.
And they have a lot of trace elements, and I think that's really what's important about those.
Yeah. And people always want to know how much you fertilize, but almost every fertilizer you get will say, oh, you're going to fertilize once a month, use it at this strength.
Yeah.
If you're going to fertilize it every time you water, use it and I'm a big believer in, well, since we do it, is we just fertilize a little bit every time. But there's also, I think you said you use Osmocote?
Yes. What I do is I do 2 things. When I have my plants indoors in the winter, I actually use just 20-20-20 fertilizer, which is one of the more common things you can see in the local stores. But I use the ones that have trace elements in it, and I use it at a quarter or less strength with every watering. Some people, like at the conservatory, you have what they call proportioner, is that what they call it? And that measures it at exactly. But I just use a very weak solution with every watering.
Yeah.
In my moss poles, what I also do is I use a product called Osmocote, which is a slow release fertilizer. It's little balls. The one I use is 14-14-14, which is basically 20-20-20 divided by times 4/5. And then what I do is I put a little bit of that at the top of my moss pole so that the fertilizer, as I water, trickles down. I don't put it at full strength either, because my theory is I am watering with water soluble fertilizer, but sometimes I might forget a week, or for whatever reason I might be away on vacation and it's not getting fertilized. So the Osmocote is just giving a gradual, slow little amount of fertilizer with every watering, which is sort of the way these plants grow in nature, because when they're growing on trees, all the material that's decaying above the tree trickles down onto the plant, and that's actually the fertilizer that the plant receives in nature.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it's just learn the plant, figure out, once again, it's sort of try to mimic what the plant is getting. And that's hard with fertilizer because you're like, what's the equivalent of 5 birds pooping on this and the rain washing it down?
Well, I think we should come out with our own fertilizer mix. And what we'll do is we'll rate the fertilizer strength with lots of little, one little bird means it's weak strength, 3 birds, and 5 birds means, gangbusters.
There you go. But then what if it's like a little, little finch versus a giant California condor?
Well, if we have like, the blue heron that ate my entire pond in one night.
Isn't an emu? Is an emu a bird? Yeah, right. An ostrich.
An emu is a bird.
Yeah, an ostrich versus a little finch. That could be like.
Yes. We'll rate them on
we'll rate them
number and size of the birds.
Yeah. I want to talk about light real quick because a lot of these plants will handle, quote, standard house. That's why they're great houseplants, because most of them will handle the ambient humidity Some won't. That's where you sort of get, okay, this one's more finicky. And light. And when I say standard light, it means, assuming you don't live in a cave or, I mean, a lot of these, even pothos, will grow in an area where there's only fluorescent, lights in an office,
Right.
as long as they're on, you don't go away for like 6 months. But some of the more higher requirements ones need some supplemental light, but for the most part, like an east window, and if you had an east window and a south window, that would be great exposure.
I think so. I think east windows are great
Mhm.
windows for houseplants because they get nice direct sun in the morning when the sun's not strong. By the time the sun hits the eaves of your house, they're already in the shade. And a lot of plants, if you're not looking for flowers, a lot of plants will do very well on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of that, you're putting in a plant room in your house.
Yes, I actually just finished my plant room.
Oh,
I moved into my house, and well, the entryway into the house was less than appealing. So I decided this is a great plant room. It's around 160 square feet, and I had debated: do I want to remove the roof and make it into a greenhouse? And then a friend of ours suggested, well, get those LED lamp fixtures.
hmm
So that's my source of lighting. They're 150 watts. I don't even run them that high. And it's so much cheaper than actually heating or cooling a greenhouse in our climate.
yeah.
The plants are thriving. And I used to not be a indoor light recommender, but now actually I'm very happy with it. I have trouble keeping the humidity below 70% because the room
Wow.
is full of plants.
Well, plants make humidity. That's the thing is,
Exactly.
if you have just a few plants, yes, then you're going to be like, okay, then get plants that aren't going to be so finicky about humidity. You can always get a humidifier, but then you're going to run that. But the more plants you have, they're transpiring and they're releasing moisture. You have pots with wet
Right.
soil. So if you have more plants you have, the more humidity, I mean, you're going to have. So that's
Right.
amazing. That's crazy.
And the only disadvantage of these lights that I would say is that they are, when you're outdoors, there's a lot of reflected sunlight. So if a
hmm
plant is under another plant, there's enough light that still reaches the leaves, but there's very little reflected light in these. So that way, if you have a plant on top of another plant, the light level drops dramatically.
Yeah. But you could
But
say,
be that as it may,
I mean, then you just go, okay, this is an understory plant, so I'm putting it under here. So it is going
right.
to get. Uh, oh, I was going to ask you something about so the floor is, what did you make the floor?
What I did is I decided I'm going to do it myself or do it yourself.
Uh-huh.
What I decided to do is I shopped around for floors, and what I liked was expensive, and what was cheap I didn't like. So, and isn't it that way?
Yes,
So,
of course.
I said, "What do I get for $5?" And they said, "You get out of here." So, uh, but what I found is handmade Saltillo tile, Saltillo, which is a town or a village in Mexico where they make tile, and it's basically terracotta tile.
hmm
I installed that. It gives an outdoor feel to it.
hmm
You do need to seal it
Okay.
because there's
Yeah.
going to be a lot of water.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. Okay.
So there was that issue. And same thing with the grout. You need to seal it well because you don't want it to be absorbed into the tile. On the other hand, it's an excellent. It's like being outdoors. It's a beautiful tile. I again because this is an indoor area. When I painted, some suggested using exterior paint,
hmm
but then I discovered that exterior paint gives off what they call volatiles. In
Yeah.
other words, things that breathe. So what I did is I got the same paint you'd use for a bathroom shower stall, and I painted that on the wall. You can get it any color you like. So I have a room that's able to withstand the high humidity without damaging
Okay.
the wall or the floors. And
Yeah.
that's important if you have an indoor
Do
space.
you use saucers under your plants? Or are you comfortable with it dropping on the floor?
Well, what I did is the room came with shelving or like attached tables
Uh-huh.
attached to the walls. I guess you said a shelving. So what I did is I kept that, and it's water resistant, but it's not waterproof. So when you buy seed starting kits, they'll have
Yeah.
those black trays
hmm
um, that you put the seed trays in. The little 6 packs, they go on a black tray. and those trays are waterproof. There's no holes in them.
Mm-hmm.
So I set all my plants in those trays, and I water. I'm careful I don't overwater, so that the water isn't dripping out the bottom of some of the trays.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's
So
protected.
yeah, just enough so it drains through the pot, but then quickly that water gets evaporated, and that's helping with the humidity as well.
Right.
So,
and a little bit of water on the bottom is okay. The plants are not sitting in water, but it does, through capillary action, may not have to water probably a little less.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when water gets on the floor, I don't worry about it. If it's a big puddle, I'll clean it up because I don't want to slip. But that's
there you go. Don't slip. Yeah. I'm like, Bruce isn't here for Tuesday Volunteer Day. You're like laying in your plant room. I mean, a good way to go is in your plant room, but is there anything, I mean, Aroids, we talked about the morphology, huge family. Some people, like, there was the Aroid craze, and I mean, we did all make, us older people did make fun of the younger people going for the Aroid craze, because some of these plants were like, when we got the variegated Monstera in from someone years ago, me and my coworker were like, okay, thanks for this variegated Monstera. And then at one point we had, every time we were trying to find more space, it was, let's go through our Aroid collection because we could get rid of that. No one likes Aroids. Right. But then everything was a species, and we're like, well, we can't get rid of species. So I do love them.
Yes.
I mean, I do love them. They're great plants, but like anything that's a craze, you start going, okay, let's just bring this down a notch. These plants are not that expensive. It's it's the market craze. I considered it like the Beanie Babies, but at least they're plants, so they have more.
Or tulip mania.
Tulip mania, exactly. So yeah, and you're seeing the prices come down. Like the Pink Princess, I think the Pink Princess philodendron was like, I don't know, thousands of dollars, and then someone just gave one to us. And I do like it because it's pink. So give me pink foliage and I'm all about it. But
here's what I want to say about Pink Princess.
Yes.
25 years ago, when I first saw this for sale, let's forget inflation prices, for $15. I said, this isn't that nice. It's pinkish. It's not like, wow. But then someone said, I have a Pink Princess to give you. When I said, oh boy, why? Because now it's $100 plant.
Yeah.
There are plants that I have in my collection that I bought for $20. Wasn't really too enamored by them, and I had one plant that was down to 3 leaves and a rotten stem. I stuck it in water. It's now 5 feet tall with multiple stems, and I got it for $15, and now it's selling between $30 and $150, depending on you.
There you go.
Who you buy it from.
Yeah.
And my plant is probably a $1,200 plant.
Yeah.
But it's not a $1,200 plant.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a nicely grown $20 plant.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I still love cosmos and nasturtium and cheap flowers, and I'll still love, certain Aroids because of the way they look, not anything because they're, on TikTok or whatever. And so I'm glad, the craze is coming back down. But if it got people into gardening and houseplants, then, thank you, Aroids. We thank you. But
and I guess can I just interrupt to say the most important thing? It's that you want to get a well-grown plant. You can get these little cuttings of some of these plants and you still pay a lot of money for it. But if they're not well-grown, they're not going to be happy. So you always want to get a well-grown plant whenever you purchase them.
And you just brought me to one point, and you and I could talk about plants forever, but I just want to talk about the one node cutting. So during the craze and some of these, plants that were being sold, is people were telling me, certain students were like, oh, I bought this, it's one node. And I would never do a one node cutting because in my mind, one node has to go under the soil and then one node above. But they do root from one nodes. But I would stay away from that. So because all these plants really root, for the most part, root all the the vining ones, the stemming ones, they already have roots formed for you pretty much. So it's just a matter of putting it in soil, or you could just start it in perlite and lay the stems on the side because you're going to get more roots generally. Right. But anyways, I would avoid the one node cutting.
And you don't really know if that node is viable or not. I've made plenty of cuttings from our plants that the nodes weren't viable because they had tried to grow the axillary bud rotted, and some plants they'll make new growth from a previously rotted axillary buds, but I don't think Aroids do it that well.
No, I don't think so either.
Or at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could talk forever about aroids because now I'm thinking of all these things in my head and I'm like, oh God, we got to stop. So maybe we'll do
that'll be next time.
Yeah, we'll do an aroid part 2. And Bruce, hey, I didn't even make fun of your accent this whole time.
Well, if you really want me to talk like a New Yorker, I can do it. But it would be wrong.
It's just better when you just randomly, when you're volunteering, you come out and you say something, and I just can't resist. Because I'm jealous.
It just comes
I was saying I want an accent, and you're like, I do have an accent. I'm like,
you have an accent. I'm the one without the accent.
Bruce, you've got the accent. Anyways,
it's okay. I'll never give up my New York roots. Ha ha. No pun intended.
Yes.
Well, this to be an ex-New Yorker.
Yeah. Well, this is good. I'm gonna have you on about other stuff because it's just good conversation. Is that good?
Yeah. And I love plants. I mean, as Marlene says, we love plants. Plants are. Without plants, we cannot breathe, and we cannot have beauty or food. So.
Yeah, that is correct. Yes. So thank you, Bruce. And until next time, and everyone else, happy gardening.